Yes, hello and welcome. It's another Confessions podcast from your friends at Radio 2, where we have the most sinful listeners that anyone could wish for, really. And jolly good thing too, otherwise we wouldn't have a feature. This week, we bring you a sinfully sneaky shop assistant, a shockingly steamy swimming pool, a stealthily scheming student, and a devious Dahl-inspired dupe. Anyway, here it all comes. Dear Father Simon and the Clemency Collective. Is that new? I think it might be. My confession takes us back to the early 1970s when flares, cheesecloth shirts and smelly Afghan coats were all the rage. Deep Purple were never off my turntable, at least in this part of the Midlands. We should do some Deep Purple.
We've done lots of Deep Purple, but we should do some more.
As a long, ginger-haired youth of around 14, my dad, a slightly lapsed Irish Catholic, believing that idle hands make work for the devil, he encouraged me to seek out what was known as a Saturday job, despite the fact that it inevitably took place on a Tuesday, Wednesday and Thursday evening, as well as the Saturday. At one point, I had 3 such jobs, one in a butcher's shop, the other a paper round, and the third as an assistant at Woolies. Yes, the fabulous Woolworths. My main job was to stack shelves, clear cardboard, and generally keep out of everyone's way. A peach of a job, however, the tenure was to be short-lived. For around 2 weeks, I've been quietly getting on with stacking shelves, folding cardboard, and feeding it to the compactor. With scant regard for any health and safety issues, we'd place tins of fruit into boxes to see them explode as they were crushed. As Matt says, different times. Seeing my ability to stack shelves and fold cardboard with proficient deftness, a career as an aspiring branch manager was clearly coming into focus. No surprise then that the store manager, Dave, approached me to mark up items of confectionery for sale on the main display. I was dizzy with the excitement of this career opportunity. He clearly saw my ability work with a minimum of supervision, so he pointed to a box which contained a marker gun and foolishly left me to my own devices to price up each item for sale. Now, to explain to the more modern generation, this was decades before barcodes and self-checkouts. This gun was a gadget that you could set prices with the use of a small knob, and by twirling this knob you selected any price up to £100. You place the gadget roller on the product, line up the items, and with a deft flicking action you set about individually pricing up dozens of items with little white sticky price tags. Do you remember these guns? Yeah, you just flick it down, there you go, little sticker on there, everyone knows how much it costs. I set off to mark up the boxes of confectionery that were to be displayed for sale. Only one problem: Dave had disappeared. So I thought, well, what would Alan Sugar do? Well, I didn't, obviously, at the time, but that's my mindset. I realised that this was all part of the initiative that an aspiring, by now regional manager would need to show. So using this newfound initiative, I set about guessing the prices for the products. Now, by way of further explanation, there was, I found out later, a pricing ledger, a Bible, if you will, that was produced weekly by Woolies to enable staff to check the prices of items and to mark the aforementioned confectionery. In my world of prog, heavy rock and spot cream, this ledger had passed me by. I can't see what the connection is between the two anyway. But fuelled by the thought of a Woolworths national manager's salary and bags of self-belief and a small smattering of stupidity, I soldiered on without the aid of the Bible. With a gleeful grin, I happily priced up dozens and dozens and dozens of chocolate bars of all shapes, sizes and brands with an array of prices that I had arrived at using my initiative. What could possibly go wrong? At some point during a particularly busy period, and while I was folding cardboard, I can hear the screams and howls of what I perceived to be a wild animal. But in Woolworths, the next minute the door to the rear store burst open and in came red-faced, apoplectic Dave, waving his arms and screaming at the top of his voice something about prices, the pricing ledger, marker gun, idiot, job, career. Was there a problem, I asked? Yes, there was a problem. Me. A Mars bar is not 1p, he yelled. A huge fruit and nut is not 1p either. And when did you ever see a packet of 6 crunches for no pence? Well, there had been an unmitigated increase in the sales of confectionery as news of the cut-price chocolates had spread throughout the local neighbourhood and brought in swarms of youngsters and parents to snap up the bargains. My philanthropic days and my future in retail appeared to be numbered. After a short, somewhat shouty lecture from Dave explaining supply and demand, sales forecast, profit and loss, at least it sounded a bit like that, I was politely asked to leave. No goodbyes, no farewells, just get your stuff and go. So I beg forgiveness, not from Dave, who I never heard from again, but obviously to the shareholders and staff of Woolworths for a seed that was sown in the early 1970s by a spotty, long-haired youth that became the beginning of the end and led to the demise of a once fantastic store. For this, I seek forgiveness. Actually, I get quite a lot of Woolworths-based confessions, everyone claiming that the demise of Woolworths is entirely their responsibility. Anyway, I quite like the idea of Russell getting the responsibility, getting the price, and then just making stuff up. There's a I'll make it a penny. There's a Twix, I'll make that 2 penny. I don't care. I'll just make stuff up. What do you think, Sister
Well,
Rebecca?
luckily he was caught at that stage before he got to regional manager status, because it sounded like he didn't have any initiative at all, even though he clearly thought he did. Because who would put 0p on a chocolate bar or 1p on a Mars bar? That's ridiculous.
He was using his initiative.
I love the way, obviously, if you put all these things together, all the different Woolies staff who want to confess and say it was them, that it was due to them that the rot set in, that probably is the reason. So I think, no, I can't forgive. Sorry.
I did expect a hard line from the business unit. Sister Bobby from the Priory.
Well, Russell does paint himself as a Robin Hood of sweeties, doesn't he, really?
Yes.
But he's not. He's just daft. Not bright, not good, not clever,
I think
unforgiving.
That's what Dave said, yeah. Called him an idiot, which is exactly what Matt will probably do.
Calls to mind the much lamented game show Price is Right, where you would have to guess the price of something, and you never would have got it right anyway. And so the same kind of thing is happening here, where he's trying to guess how much should you be paying for 6 Twixes.
It's clearly not 0p.
It's not 0p, but it's very close to that, I would say. And probably in the early 1970s, the Mars bar was about a penny, or perhaps 10 pence. How much was it in the early 1970s?
No,
Bobby?
what I was going to say was, but the big fruit and nut is not the same price as a Mars bar. That's where the stupidity comes in.
Well, I would argue they are very close in price, and for that reason, and also for sparking all those great memories of The Price is Right, I am going to say I forgive.
Here's tonight's tale from Neil. Thank you, Neil. Dear Simon and the Venerable Collective, my story goes back to when I worked at a leisure centre in Cheshire in the 70s. I was the general dog's body at the centre, doing everything from sweeping up and cleaning toilets to setting out the equipment when the sports hall was being used for a new activity. I was also one of the lifeguards.
Spare time.
Clearly not a specialist,
Fully qualified.
And I spent many a tedious hour wandering around the pool, hoping that surprise objects wouldn't appear in the water.
Oh, no.
Like items of clothing, floating plasters or other...
Yes.
Good, that's what
Veruca sock.
People are eating.
In fact, the only redeeming factor for being a lifeguard, as most teenagers in that position would admit, is that there were lots of opportunities to chat up girls. I was at different times, Matt.
Different times, everyone. Yeah.
No running, no bombing, no chatting up of girls.
No.
I was allowed to use all of the sports amenities for free when I wasn't working. And I took the occasional swim in the pool so that I could keep myself in good shape, ready for the day when I would have to dive in and rescue an attractive lady swimmer who was in distress.
Different times.
One thing I was not allowed to do was to carry out any of the maintenance chores on the pool. This was strictly for the managers of the centre, who were the only ones who knew how to adjust the water temperature, the level of chlorine, and when to do a backwash, that kind of thing.
Ooh.
However, one of the managers, I will call him Keith, occasionally allowed me to accompany him into the plant room where the complicated equipment such as the boiler and pumps were. Thanks to his enthusiasm in telling me everything, I knew how to get into the control room and, more importantly, what most of the controls did. So it happened one weekend when I was coming to the end of my Saturday shift that I had an idea. Since the next day would be my day off, I planned to come back in for a swim. I also remembered, however, that the management had introduced some new austerity measures, including being rather mean with the heating. The temperature of the water had seemed a bit cool recently. I think you can probably guess what's coming next. So before I left work, I sneaked into the plant room when no one was looking, went straight to the temperature control knob, which I turned up by a few degrees. Then I went home, knowing that the water would gradually heat up overnight and be ready to give me a more comfortable bathing experience the next day. So it was on the Sunday morning, with great anticipation, that I arrived at the centre just as it was opening. This meant I could get in a few lengths before it got busy. But when I walked into the reception area and looked towards the windows, behind which was the swimming pool, I realised I might have overdone things a little. Water was cascading down the glass. Undeterred, I put my trunks on in the changing rooms and went poolside, where I immediately noticed the atmosphere was like entering a sauna. There were little wisps of what looked like steam rising from the surface of the water. It looked basically like a swamp with dangerous pools waiting to get you. Anyway, in keeping with my usual routine, I jumped straight into the deep end.
What an idiot.
And yes, yeah, of course. And as you can imagine, it was like jumping into a very hot bath or a hot tub. I then discovered that when I tried to swim, I immediately broke into a sweat, and it was impossible to swim more than a few strokes.
Who'd have thought? Is it sweating in a hot... Yeah, who'd have thought?
We're going to miss this, Deadly, when you're gone. Without being overcome by exhaustion. By now, the usual Sunday morning punters were turning up and also discovering that it was painful to attempt any swimming at all in the swimming pool, and all I could do was just wallow around.
Wallow.
Oh, God.
It's hot in here.
They were mostly older people, a label I would now apply to myself, so I like to think that they actually quite enjoyed the experience. A few younger ladies broke sweat too. This was a highlight. I had
Well, really.
created.
Times.
Yes, I think.
I had created Cheshire's first jacuzzi, even if we hadn't heard of them back then. 10 minutes and you were done, emerging lobster-like into the cold air. Took a couple of days for things to return to normal, and needless to say, I got into hot water.
Oh!
So I beg. A number of people have already written down hot water.
Bit.
Yes, that's the turning point, I think.
I beg forgiveness for at least three things. Firstly, I must have wasted a huge amount of gas to heat up the water at a cost to the local ratepayers, a phrase you don't hear much these days. I'd also, ask your parents, I'd also ruined the day for other swimmers, plus I got the boss into trouble for letting me into the plant room in the first place and having to explain to his boss why the heating bills were so expensive that month. I also accelerated the deterioration of the tiles in the pool, which subsequently needed an expensive shutdown.
Oh.
And a repair a few months later. Sister Rebecca.
Yeah, he lost me there, actually, with that pun, I'm afraid, on hot water. But
Well-
he was losing me anyway, because I love the way, first of all, he was totally selfish.
What was difficult to follow?
The hot water there, he lost my...
sympathy,
My
I
sympathy,
see.
exactly. He was totally selfish in setting the temperature for himself the following day. And also the fact that he saw steam when he went in, and he didn't bother checking it before he jumped in. So that wasn't very clever. So for all those reasons, and the bad pun, I am not going to forgive.
I'm out.
Yeah, the bad
Deadly.
point. It was a turning point. There's no doubt about it. It's slightly odd that if it's your day off, you go back to work, even though it is to swim. It's an odd thing to do.
He's trying to tone up.
Yeah, well,
To look after the lady swimmers,
and I'm amazed. An organisation, certainly not the BBC, where maintenance is the manager's role. I find that very strange.
Is that right?
Yeah, they don't do maintenance.
What about if you need a sustaining pedal? Would that be your job?
Well, there's probably one in a cupboard somewhere, and I'll try and get into it before the end of the night. So I'm not going to forgive, I don't think. I'm not going to forgive. No, I'm not.
Harsh.
Well, it's quite a costly thing to
Harsh,
do.
but fair.
Repair the damage and all that sort of stuff.
Brother Matthew.
Yeah, swimming in warm water always feels
nice.
like it's going to be a great idea,
Yeah.
and it's always awful. It's a bit like jacuzzis. Seems like it's going to be a great idea. They're always awful.
They're not.
So, yes, no, they are.
lovely.
We've all been in
Jacuzzi.
within minutes. Oh, get me out of this. This is
hot
awful.
tub.
No, hot tubs, the lot, a waste of space.
Have you not got one?
No, and I do. I would turn it down.
You've got a neighbour who's got one and you're
yes.
jealous.
Well, yeah, and what are they doing out in the middle of March in a jacuzzi?
It's the whole
And
point.
Well, no, exactly. Well, and then just because they've got a jacuzzi and they're up until... Anyway.
Garden envy, garden envy.
For that reason alone, I am not going to forgive.
Oh,
Is it
Yes,
at
that
the
makes
left-hand
sense.
side or the right-hand
It
side?
doesn't, no, it really doesn't matter where, but, and playing,
not bad
and
for
also,
him.
it's
Not bad for
also
Enfield.
awful. I've been in the jacuzzi and they're all awful.
you've been in the jacuzzi.
Yeah, I've been in them.
So for that reason,
Yeah, I don't forgive.
all right. Tonight's confession comes from someone who signed it Meaga, okay, as in M-E-A-G-R-E. Dear Father Simon and the rest of the Urbane Cookie Collective. I like that. Thank you. I have to go back to 1983 for this particular misdemeanor. I was a student at Aberdeen University. One of my subjects was geography. As a favourite subject, I decided to join the Geography Society, or the JogSoc, as it was known. One of the benefits of being a society member was that you could borrow one of the university minibuses and have weekends away at Taradale House near the Muir of Ord, north of Inverness. Provided, of course, you had a legitimate educational reason for doing so. The JogSoc reason was always that the area around Taradale House was rich in fascinating geographical features for us to study. Any scurrilous suggestions that these weekends were just an excuse for drinking and carrying on were always strenuously denied. This particular weekend was one that everyone was looking forward to. And so I sat my 5-minute minibus driving test, and we were all set. A fantabulous weekend beckoned, with one exception, and we'll call him Brian, mostly because I can't actually remember the blighter's name. Brian was a know-it-all, a blowhard, or as we say up here, someone who blethers away. Actually, I've had to amend that slightly.
I'll bet.
Having checked.
Yeah.
Trying to get a rude word away there, but we were smarter. If you'd been anywhere, Brian had been there first, been there longer, or had a much better time there than you. I think we all know someone like Brian. And he let you know it in a loud, nasal, immensely irritating voice. On our first night, we were away, we were sitting talking idly about places that we wanted to visit, when Brian, with an uncharacteristic lack of Brianness, admitted that he'd never ever been to Ireland. Really? Never been to Ireland? I questioned further. You've never tasted real Guinness then? And then I added, for no apparent reason, the one with stones in. He had, much to his annoyance, to admit that this was indeed the case, but his curiosity was roused. Stones? In Guinness? Well, I said, well, they call them stones. They're actually very chewy and absolutely delicious. Of course, you can normally only get them from St James Gate in Dublin, which is where it comes from. There's a guy there who keeps in touch with all the folk who make these. He somehow manages to get hold of the real stuff when he's been over for a visit. I could try and get some for you, I said. Yeah, the Guinness with stones in. Brian was absolutely delighted. He'd never had this before, surprisingly. And so the next morning, with Brian's pleading still in my ears from the night before, I set off to find the real Guinness, the Guinness with the stones in. That night, when Brian appeared, there was a special pint of stout waiting for him on the table. The real Guinness, you know, the one with the stones in. We all watched with bated breath as he took his first mouthful. Oh, he said, obviously disappointed, it just tastes the same. Keep going. You've not caught a stone yet, I said. And then the shock, the chewing mouth, the, I assume, feigned exclamations of extreme pleasure as he caught a total of 11 stones in his pint. And then the demand for more. Sorry, Brian, that's all I could get. I was hoping that you could share it maybe with everyone else who hasn't had the real Guinness, you know, the one with stones in. You snooze, you lose, he sneered, and then wandered off being very Brian-y. I wandered off too, in the opposite direction, to the kitchen, in fact, to make sure that there was no evidence of the can of ordinary Guinness and the tin of prunes that I'd bought from the local shop earlier in the day. Guinness and prunes, you know, Father Simon, it's a thing. So I do need to seek absolution, not from Brian, because the Brians of this world deserve everything they get, but from the guys who shared a room with him that night. Well, you know how that
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. And, well, no one is going to have a whole tin of prunes, are they, without it having, effects. With a duvet razor. And also, absolution from all the bartenders, off-licence staff, and on the off chance that he'd ever made it there, the staff of St James Gate, Dublin, who might have been faced with an angry-faced Brian demanding to know why he couldn't get a decent Guinness stone in his beer anywhere, because he'd been asking. Anyway, well, you know, Brian's obviously one of those people who everyone was quite happy to set up, but Guinness and prunes, it might be a thing to try tonight. What do you think, Sister?
Actually, it sounds like they might go together quite well. You know, bitter Guinness and sort of slightly sweetish prunes. You never know.
I'll leave that with you.
I wonder where that idea of Guinness with stones came from. Just sort of popped into his head. Genius. I think I did actually think it was going to be a lot worse. That it wasn't going to be prunes. It was going to be something not really edible in there.
No,
so I was relieved when I heard it was
fine.
Prunes. And sorry for the people who had to share the room with him that night. But I think it was very funny. And you're forgiven.
I don't know whether Meaga is a male or female, actually. I don't think there's any evidence to suggest one way or the other. Anyway, Sister Bobby from the Priory.
Yeah, it's I'm a bit like Rebecca. One thing I wanted to say, though, is Brian didn't pretend to know that he'd had the Guinness with the stones. When he was being Brian, you know, been there, done that, better, bigger, better, you know, got the T-shirt. When Megan said, did you have the Guinness with the stones, he went, no. He didn't lie about it. So I think they were a little bit unfair on tricking him. However, fruit soaked in alcohol is fabulous. So I think Guinness and prunes is great. So no harm done. You're forgiven. And he was a little tiny bit annoying, so you're forgiven.
No harm done. I'm not entirely sure that we know about that.
I'm starting to wonder whether there could be a thing in this with the prunes in the Guinness, because I'm wondering whether that might actually enhance it. I've had Guinness in Ireland, basically, obviously, tastes far better. However, takes forever for them to pour it. It just, you may as well leave the pub, and come back in half an hour after you've had some chips, because it takes forever to get served.
Yes.
It's absolute nightmare.
Awful.
So for that reason alone, I am going to forgive.
So you actually think that might be...
I think Nige should investigate us having Guinness with prunes in it. I think there's something in it.
I think it definitely could be a thing.
You have pork cooked in cola, don't you?
You do?
Yeah, but that's pork.
You have steak and ale pie with
But that's
ale.
steak.
And you have cherries and
You
kirsch.
have prunes in Guinness.
Sam sends in tonight's confession, yours via email or via the website. Dear Simon and the Forgiving Few, my story takes place during the time when I, bored expat wife from Scotland, with nothing to do in a new hot and dusty country, decided to seek out a job. Whilst my husband was busy at work, I'd had enough of shopping, sand and the very hot sun, which, as you might imagine, does nothing for a Scottish blue complexion. After about 6 months and no call from anyone who wanted to employ me, my husband's firm took pity on me and offered me a job in the office. I wasn't really sure what the office job was going to be, but I accepted gladly. Whilst it was hot and dusty outside, office space in the air-conditioned room was at a premium. Unfortunately for me, I was accorded a desk in said cool office. Unfortunately for me, however, being the new girl meant that my desk consisted of a tiny space right by the door next to the bin. I very quickly realised that communication here consisted mostly of shouting at each other, whatever the occasion. A new birth amongst office members resulted in mass hysteria and shouting that went on for hours. A lost stapler had a similar effect. The shouting was just as incessant, and so I took, during work, to listening to Radio 2 on my headphones through my computer. So I carried on with my work in my corner behind my plant and my pen holders and my earphones in and tried to drown out the decibels. It wasn't all bad, though, because as the shouting always had to be accompanied by something, it was usually accompanied by cake. Now, I haven't just included this cake because of the fish in a bag, but it's going to make your stomach rumble just a little bit. Okay. Not just a bag of cakes, but a whole assortment of cakes, both sweet and savoury, pretty much enough to sink a battleship. And even though I was the standoffish quiet one in the corner, I always got my share of cake to take back to my little haven. As I said, the office was cramped and there were so many desks packed in there, there wasn't really much room at all. However, there was always one desk free in the corner by the window, and in the first few weeks that I'd been there, nobody had ever sat at this desk. Until Cake Day. Suddenly, news of Cake Day must have telepathically reached, let's call her Mrs. Miggins, a rather rotund, shouty person from the office downstairs. Suddenly, Mrs. Miggins was sat at the empty desk, tucking into our office cakes and merrily joining in with the shouting. She appeared by magic like this on the next Cake Day, and the next, and the next. It turned out that she was maintaining this desk precisely for Cake Days, a desk to which she was not entitled and which cost us space in our already tightly packed office so that she could come and gorge herself on our cakes. So I hatched a plan. I don't think Roald Dahl is read much in this particular part of the world, but at the time my son was enjoying the Twits, and it brought back memories of how much I'd liked it as a child myself, especially when Mr. and Mrs. Twit played tricks on each other, like disguising worms for spaghetti. Remembering the trick Mr. Twit had played on Mrs. Twit, whereby he convinced her that she was shrinking by gluing a small amount of wood onto her walking stick and the chair legs each night, I decided to teach Mrs. Miggins a lesson. Every evening after the team had gone home, and I was waiting for my husband to finish work, I very slowly started moving the office a few centimetres away from the wall towards her desk. This consisted of moving desks, chairs, large pot plants and bins and so on, so that eventually the gaps between the desks became ever so slightly narrower. To you and me, this wouldn't have had much effect, but after a few weeks and a good few Cake Days, Mrs. Miggins was beginning to struggle to fit through the gap next to her desk to sit down and gorge herself on the offerings. This resulted in much shouting and huffing, but she pushed on through and continued with the loud conversation and the face feeding. After a few more weeks, however, there was a very big celebration as the wife of a boss had just had a baby, and the cake offerings were even more extravagant than ever. There was much shouting and backslapping and general brouhaha, and of course, magically, Mrs. Miggins appeared to sniff out the treats. During this time, I had been very busy with my slow office shrinking, and this time the ever-expanding Mrs. Miggins really did get well and truly stuck between her desk and the filing cabinet next to it, and she went absolutely crazy. She tried to climb out but couldn't manage it. She tried to call under, but she couldn't manage that either. Eventually, she had to call for help, furniture was shifted, and she sailed out never to take part in Cake Day ever again. And so I need forgiveness, not from Mrs. Miggins, but from the rest of the office, who had no idea what was going on, who probably never read the twits, and who had no idea why the standoffish blue-skinned Scottish woman in the corner by the bin found this whole incident completely hilarious. I thank you, says Sam. But it is an interesting use. We've often had sort of tales of people getting their own back, but never using that twit thing of making someone feel as though the office is getting smaller. Quite intriguing. What do you make of that, Sister Rebecca?
I think that was genius. What a great idea. And, I mean, the idea of somebody maintaining a desk just so they could have cakes is outrageous.
Who do you share an office with?
I share an office with Matt and Alan Dedicoat. And the newsreader of the day,
yes.
If it's not Alan Dedicoat.
Yes. How about rearranging the desk to make Alan feel as though his space is getting smaller
That's a very
and smaller?
good idea.
And then after a few days, he might just get up and leave.
Yeah.
Not that we want that to happen.
He's very particular about his personal space as well, so I think we could really alarm him in quite a big way.
Definitely do this.
He's also very particular about cake. Have you ever noticed?
That's very
quite
true.
partial to. What I'm really interested
I haven't finished yet.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry.
I forgive though, because I think it's great, very clever, and Mrs. Miggins sounds really annoying.
Now, Nigel.
Sorry about that, Becky Boom. Sorry. Yeah, well, I can't. Everyone else must have noticed because this was done over a number of weeks. It wasn't each time just before the cake. The whole place was moved. So you'd think her colleagues must have noticed that the office was moving as well.
Ever so slightly imperceptibly, these things change, you know.
Well, she is one blue-skinned warrior who is very clever. So I think it's that Roald Dahl would have loved that, and that's a very surreal story. I do like the idea of people coming up just to eat cake, though. I think that's rather fabulous.
It's a bit like Bob Harris, isn't it? Coming here
That's
every
true.
time you
Yeah,
cook.
just because he's got a show on at 7 o'clock, he comes in for a bit of food. What do you think?
And for that reason alone,
all right,
steady on. I have not
Get
finished
on,
yet.
yes.
I'm not reason alone.
Yeah.
I don't forgive you,
I'm
Sam.
out. Yes. Okay.
Brilliant. I love this.
Down to you, Matt.
We've got a coffee machine on this floor that I notice quite a lot of people are using who don't work on this station or in this building, and they're coming in for the coffee. So I think I need to come up with some kind of plan similar to this that will deter those people from using our coffee
Like a
machine.
trap.
Yes, I think so. And I'm all for rearranging Deadly's office. So for that reason, I am going to forgive.
They were this week's confessions. There were some good ones in there, but we'd like yours, please, just in case we've made you think of something you did a while back and you haven't told anybody and it's troubling you. Well, send it to confessions@bbc.co.uk. More in a week, and the Weekly Mayo available to download now and every Friday. Thank you so much for taking part.